The cold emptiness of the red planet stretched out in every direction, a vast, unforgiving desert of crimson dust. Jane Connor blinked against the sharp, stinging wind as it kicked up small particles of sand, forcing her to shield her eyes. She stood on the surface of Mars, abandoned and forgotten. The once promising mission had turned into a nightmare, an endless survival game where time seemed to have stopped. She had been left behind, stranded alongside one man, David Riker, for what felt like an eternity. David stood a few meters away, his suit still dusty from their latest attempt to repair the communication tower. It was futile. They both knew it, but they kept trying. The communication systems, their lifeline to Earth, had been down for years now, and every attempt to fix them only ended in more frustration. It had been decades since they'd lost contact with Earth, and the weight of isolation hung heavy in the thin Martian atmosphere. Earth might as well have forgotten they existed. Another day, another failure, Jane muttered, her voice cracking through the intercom in her suit. She slumped down against a jagged rock, trying to catch her breath. Her suit's oxygen levels blinked dangerously low, a reminder that they had to conserve every precious bit of air. David walked over and crouched beside her, his expression hard but sympathetic. "We'll figure it out," he said, though neither of them believed it anymore. His once strong voice was weary, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed after decades of struggle. They had arrived on Mars over 100 years ago as part of the first wave of settlers. What was supposed to be a monumental achievement for humanity had turned into a prison sentence. A catastrophic storm during their early days on Mars had destroyed their return ship, leaving them marooned. And as the years passed, the hope of rescue had faded into the background, like a distant dream they could no longer remember clearly. The worst part wasn't just the isolation, it was time itself. The mission had involved advanced cryogenic technology to prolong life, but due to malfunctions, Jane and David were forced to experience time at an unnaturally slow pace. Days turned into decades, and yet they barely aged. The malfunction had turned Mars into an unending, timeless purgatory. They were the only two left from the original team of explorers. Everyone else had succumbed to the harshness of the planet or had simply given up. Jane sighed and closed her eyes. She could still remember the excitement she had felt all those years ago. She had been a scientist, filled with hope, eager to make history. Mars had represented humanity's next great leap. Now it was a barren wasteland that had stolen their future. "We have to try something different," Jane whispered, her eyes opening to the endless horizon. "We can't keep going like this." David nodded silently. There was no point in arguing. They both knew the truth. If they didn't figure something out soon, their oxygen supplies would run dry. And when that happened, there would be no more tomorrows. That night, Jane sat alone inside the dimly lit shelter, staring at a small, flickering screen that displayed the Earthrise over the Martian landscape. It had been over a century since she'd last seen Earth with her own eyes. Now it was just an image. An unreachable beacon floating in the cold black void. The shelter creaked with the gusts of wind outside, the sound haunting in the eerie silence of the planet. David sat across the room, tinkering with a broken piece of equipment, his hands methodical, though the results were fruitless. "Do you ever think about what's left back there?" Jane asked, breaking the silence. "What Earth must look like now?" David paused, his hands still for the first time in hours. "Try not to," he admitted after a moment. "It's been too long. The world we left behind, it's probably not even the same anymore." Jane nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. The people they had known, their families, friends, long gone. Even if they somehow managed to make contact, would there be anyone left who remembered them? Would anyone care? "I still think about my sister," Jane whispered. "She was so young when I left. I always wondered what kind of life she'd have." She smiled faintly at the memory, but it was a distant one, like a dream from another lifetime. David didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. Time on Mars had done strange things to them. At first, they had fought against the endless expanse of days, the crushing sense of isolation. But eventually, they had settled into a routine, not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. They became ghosts, drifting through the same motions day after day, year after year, waiting for something to change, waiting for a miracle that never came. But tonight, something was different. Jane glanced at the monitor showing Earth, her mind racing. We've been trying to repair the communications array for years, but what if we've been going about it the wrong way? David looked up, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? What if we stop trying to send signals out and start listening instead? Jane's voice grew stronger as the idea took hold. There might be something out there. Maybe Earth has been trying to contact us, but we've been too focused on transmitting to notice. David set down his tools and leaned back, considering her words. It's a long shot. So is everything else we've tried. For the first time in years, hope flickered in Jane's chest. If there was even a chance that Earth was still out there, trying to reach them, they had to try. They owed it to themselves, to the people they had left behind. And perhaps, after all these years, they weren't as forgotten as they had feared. The following days were a blur of activity, a sudden surge of purpose driving Jane and David. They worked tirelessly, rerouting power from less essential systems to boost the receivers and recalibrating the ancient technology that had sat dormant for so long. The shelter, once a lifeless tomb, now buzzed with energy as they raced against time, the stakes higher than ever before. "We've got it," Jane announced, her voice laced with excitement. She stood over the communication console, the flicker of a signal finally appearing on the cracked screen. David rushed over, his eyes wide with disbelief. After decades of silence, they had managed to revive the long-dead equipment. Faint but steady signal was now pulsing through the void, a fragile lifeline to the outside world. "Is it stable?" David asked, his voice cautious but filled with hope. He knew that even the smallest malfunction could shatter their chances of survival. "For now," Jane replied, her fingers deftly adjusting the dials and sliders. "But we need to be quick. The system is ancient. I don't know how long it will hold." David nodded, his heart pounding. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he glanced at the nearby viewport. The endless expanse of the red planet stretched out before him, a silent reminder of the years they had spent forgotten and alone. "Send the distress signal," he urged, his voice tight with urgency. "Let them know we're still here." Jane's fingers flew across the console as she input the preset distress code, a code that had been programmed into the system long before their arrival. Designed for an emergency like this, she pressed the final button, and the console emitted a low hum, sending their message into the void. "This is Jane Harper and David Walker of the Odyssey mission. We are alive. Please respond." Over. Jane's voice wavered slightly as she spoke, the gravity of the situation weighing on her. They waited. Seconds ticked by, each one stretching into eternity. The console remained silent, save for the crackle of static. "Do you think they'll hear us?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jane didn't answer right away. She leaned forward, staring intently at the screen, willing the universe to acknowledge their call for help. "We have to believe they will," she said finally, though uncertainty gnawed at her insides. Suddenly, the console emitted a high-pitched beep. Both Jane and David froze. Response. The crackling intensified, and then, through the haze of static, a voice broke through. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Harper, Walker, is this? Repeat, can you hear us?" David's heart leaped into his throat. "They heard us," he shouted, unable to contain his joy. After all this time, someone actually heard us. Jane's hands trembled as she reached for the mic. "This is Jane Harper and David Walker. We hear you. We are alive. Repeat, we are alive." The response came swiftly, the voice on the other end growing clearer with each word. "This is the USS Horizon. We received your signal. Stand by for instructions." Tears welled up in Jane's eyes as she slumped back into her chair, the magnitude of what had just happened crashing over her. For the first time in a century, they were no longer alone. David gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. "What now?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of relief and fear. "What do we do now?" "They'll come for us," Jane replied, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "They have to." But even as she said the words, doubt lingered. The red planet had changed them both, physically, mentally. A century of isolation had forged them into something different. Would Earth even recognize them anymore? Would they still be considered human? And if they were rescued, what kind of world would they return to? David, sensing her unease, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've survived this long. We can face whatever comes next, together." Jane smiled weakly, but her mind raced with questions. The voice from the horizon had been a lifeline. But what would their salvation truly look like? They spent the next several hours preparing. Supplies were packed, systems double-checked, and personal logs recorded. Neither Jane nor David wanted to leave anything to chance. This was their one shot at escaping the red prison that had held them captive for a century. As the sun dipped below the Martian horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape, Jane and David gathered by the shelter's entrance. The Martian dust swirled lazily in the thin atmosphere, a familiar sight after so many years, yet tonight it felt different. The air was charged with anticipation. "I can't believe we're finally getting out of here," David murmured, his eyes scanning the crimson sky. "Do you think Earth has changed as much as we have?" Jane sighed. "It has to have changed. 100 years is a long time. We might not even recognize it." David frowned. "And what if they don't recognize us? What if we don't belong there anymore?" Jane shook her head, brushing a strand of her graying hair behind her ear. "We can't worry about that now. We've come too far." Suddenly, the console inside the shelter beeped again. A message from the horizon. Jane and David rushed back to the control panel. "Harper, Walker," the voice from the horizon crackled through the static. "Prepare for extraction. Our landing craft is en route. ETA is 30 minutes. Hang tight." David exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible. "We're going home." The next half hour passed in a blur of final preparations. As the minutes ticked by, the sky above them began to shimmer with the faint outline of a descending craft, its sleek shape cut through the thin Martian atmosphere. Beacon of hope amidst the desolation. Jane and David stood together, side by side, as the craft's landing thrusters activated, sending a wave of dust swirling around them. The craft touched down softly, its door opening with a quiet hiss. A figure emerged, clad in a sleek, futuristic spacesuit. They raised a hand in greeting. "Jane Harper, David Walker, we're here to bring you home." But as Jane looked at the rescuer, something tugged at her heart. Home. What did that even mean after 100 years on a desolate planet? A place, a time, a memory. Or had Mars, in its brutal, unforgiving way, become home after all? The thought lingered as she and David stepped toward the future, unsure of what awaited them beyond the red horizon. The interior of the landing craft was sleek and sterile, its walls gleaming under the artificial lighting. Jane and David had been guided into a compartment at the rear of the ship, the door sealing with a soft click behind them. The rescuer, their visor still obscuring their face, had spoken only briefly after greeting them, just enough to direct them into their seats and prepare for takeoff. As the ship began to hum with the power of its engines, Jane's hands gripped the armrests. For so long, the thought of escape had felt like a distant dream. But now, as they lifted off from the Martian surface, an unsettling feeling crept into her chest. She turned to look at David, who seemed equally lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the viewport. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper over the rumble of the ascending craft. David blinked, snapping out of his reverie. "Yeah," he said, though his tone was unconvincing. "It's just thought this moment would feel different. Happier." Jane nodded, understanding completely. The exhilaration of being rescued had been quickly overtaken by a strange, hollow uncertainty. For a century, Mars had been their reality. The barren landscape, the endless solitude, it had shaped them, defined them. Now, as they left it behind, they couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The ship's ascent was smooth, and within minutes, the reddish tint of the Martian sky had been replaced by the inky blackness of space. Jane caught her breath as the shelter, their home for so many years, shrank into a dot below them. It felt surreal to see it from this perspective, so small, so fragile, like a forgotten relic of their past lives. As they broke through the planet's atmosphere, a sudden calm fell over the cabin. The engines quieted, and the weightlessness of space enveloped them. For a moment, Jane felt free, unburdened by gravity or the crushing isolation of the red planet. "We'll be docking with the horizon shortly," the rescuer's voice crackled through the ship's comms. The visor of their helmet remained down, their face obscured. "You'll be given medical attention and debriefed. We'll take care of everything from here on out." Jane exchanged a glance with David. Debriefed. The word sounded clinical, cold, as if they were subjects in an experiment rather than survivors of a century-long ordeal. She swallowed her unease and turned back toward the viewport, watching as a massive ship came into view. The USS Horizon, their savior. The vessel was unlike anything Jane had ever seen. It was far more advanced than the Odyssey had been, with sleek lines and a shimmering surface that reflected the faint light of distant stars. It loomed ahead of them, its docking bay doors opening like the maw of some great, metallic beast. With a soft thud, the craft connected with the horizon, and the airlock hissed as it equalized the pressure. The door to their compartment slid open, revealing a group of figures in matching uniforms, their faces visible now. They moved with purpose, their expressions neutral. "Welcome aboard the USS Horizon," one of them said, stepping forward. "I'm Lieutenant Miller. We're here to escort you to the medical bay for a full examination." David stood first, his muscles stiff from the journey, but there was an air of hesitation about him. "Thank you," he said, his voice measured, "but we're fine. We just need to know what's going on." "What year is it? What's happened since we've been gone?" Lieutenant Miller's expression didn't change. "All of your questions will be answered during the debrief. First, we need to ensure that you're both in good health after such a prolonged period in isolation. Please follow us." Jane felt a chill run down her spine. The way they were being treated, handled, felt wrong. There was no celebration, no overwhelming relief at their miraculous survival. Instead, it was as though they were merely another task on a list, something to be processed and studied. As they followed the crew down the corridor, the ship's interior felt cold and impersonal. The walls were a dull gray, lined with screens displaying streams of data Jane couldn't begin to understand. She could feel David's unease growing with each step, mirroring her own. The medical bay was stark and clinical, as expected. 2 doctors, each wearing the same uniform as the rest of the crew, gestured for them to sit on the examination tables. Without a word, they began running scans, checking vital signs, and drawing blood. Jane flinched as the needle pierced her skin, though the doctor administering the test remained silent. Their eyes focused on the data appearing on the screen beside them. "You've both adapted remarkably well," one of the doctors finally said, breaking the tense silence. "Your bodies have acclimated to the conditions of Mars in ways we didn't expect." Jane frowned. "What do you mean? What's wrong with us?" The doctor looked up from the screen, a strange expression crossing their face. "Nothing is wrong with you. Quite the opposite, actually. Your bodies have developed increased resilience, especially considering the length of your stay in such a harsh environment." David shot Jane a worried look. Resilience. What does that mean? Before the doctor could answer, the door to the medical bay slid open, and Lieutenant Miller returned, flanked by 2 more uniformed crew members. "The captain is ready for your debrief," he said curtly. "Please follow us." Jane's heart pounded in her chest as they were led through the labyrinthine corridors of the horizon. The ship's design was pristine, but it felt more like a machine than a place where people lived. There was no warmth, no indication of a crew with personalities or stories. Just cold efficiency. Finally, they were brought to a large room where a tall figure stood waiting at the head of a long table. The captain. His uniform was adorned with insignias that Jane didn't recognize, and his face was lined with the weight of command. "Jane Harper, David Walker," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Please, have a seat." They did as instructed, sitting across from the captain as the doors behind them sealed shut. Jane could feel David's tension, his eyes never leaving the captain's face. "First of all, let me commend you both for your perseverance," the captain began, his tone measured. "Surviving a century in isolation on Mars is nothing short of extraordinary. But as I'm sure you've already guessed, much has changed in the time you've been away." Jane's stomach twisted. How much has changed? The captain took a deep breath. "You've been gone for 106 years. In that time, the world you once knew has evolved. Mars is no longer a distant frontier. It's now the center of an entirely new phase of human civilization." David leaned forward, his face pale. "What do you mean? Are there people on Mars now?" The captain nodded. "Not just people. Colonies, infrastructure, a thriving society. The planet you once called home is no longer barren. It's been transformed." Jane's mind reeled, struggling to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. The world had moved on without them. Mars had become something unrecognizable. An entire civilization had risen in their absence. "And us?" Jane asked, her voice trembling. "What are we to all of this?" The captain's expression hardened. "You are anomalies, survivors of a lost age, and as such, your existence raises questions. Questions that we need answers to." Jane's throat tightened. "What kind of questions?" The captain leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "How you survived for so long without aging. How your bodies adapted to conditions that should have killed you. And most importantly, what that means for the future of humanity on Mars." The weight of the captain's words pressed down on Jane and David like a suffocating fog. Questions about their survival, about their bodies. This wasn't the welcome home they had hoped for. They weren't just survivors. They were experiments, enigmas that needed to be unraveled. Jane's mind raced as she tried to piece together what he was saying. "What do you mean by adapted?" "We lived off ration supplies, recycled water, and a crumbling shelter. There was no special adaptation. We just survived." The captain's gaze remained cold, calculating. "You survived too well. We've reviewed the data from the Odyssey, the mission logs, the environmental factors on Mars at the time. All simulations indicate you should not have made it past the first few decades. Yet here you sit, in perfect health, no signs of aging, no cellular degradation." David's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Are you saying we're some kind of freaks?" "Not freaks," the captain said, unblinking. "Miracles, but miracles that require explanation. There are those who believe the conditions on Mars may have triggered something unprecedented in your biology. Evolution at an accelerated rate. We intend to find out how." Jane's heart pounded in her chest, and a cold sweat broke out along her spine. "What does that mean for us? What do you plan to do?" The captain leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "It means you'll be studied, carefully and extensively. There are scientists eager to understand the physiological changes you've undergone. Once we have those answers, we can determine your place in the new Martian society." David slammed his hand on the table, his voice raw with anger. "We didn't survive a century alone just to be treated like lab rats. You can't do this to us." The captain's face remained impassive, as if David's outburst had no effect. "You misunderstand. This isn't a request. The world has changed, and so have you. We need to understand how and why. You represent the future of our expansion, whether you like it or not." Jane felt a deep sense of dread creeping over her. They weren't being rescued. They were being taken by a society that had moved on, one that saw them not as people, but as relics, valuable only for what they could offer to the scientific community. Suddenly, the room felt too small, the walls closing in. Jane's breath quickened. "You can't just imprison us. We're not experiments. We're people." The captain raised an eyebrow. "No one said anything about imprisonment. You'll be free to move within designated areas. But until we fully understand your condition, you'll remain under observation. It's for your safety and for ours." David shot to his feet, glaring at the captain. "This isn't freedom. It's captivity." The captain stood as well, his face stern. "It's necessary. You've been isolated for over a century. We don't know what prolonged exposure to Mars has done to you. And until we do, we can't allow you to roam freely." Jane could feel the panic rising inside her. Her mind flashed back to the endless days on Mars, alone, trapped in the shelter with only the barren landscape outside. The thought of being confined again, even on this pristine ship, made her feel like she was suffocating. "I want to speak to someone in charge of this operation," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. "There has to be someone higher up than you. Someone who'll listen to reason." The captain studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp. "I'm afraid there's no one else who can override this decision. But rest assured, this is for the greater good. We're not the enemies here, Ms. Harper. We're the ones who saved you." David scoffed. "Saved us? You don't even know what we've been through. You have no idea what it was like down there, year after year, with no hope, no future. We didn't ask for this. Whatever this is that's happening to us. And we sure as hell didn't ask to become your next science project." The captain remained silent, his eyes locking with David's, unflinching. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice low and final. "You're free to rest in your quarters for now. The medical team will need more data from both of you soon. Take some time to adjust. I suggest you start coming to terms with your new reality." Without another word, he turned and gestured to the two guards who had remained by the door. They stepped forward, motioning for Jane and David to follow. The captain's authority hung in the air like a shadow as they were escorted out of the room. As they walked back down the ship's corridors, the sterile walls seemed even more confining than before. The once miraculous escape from Mars now felt like a hollow victory, tainted by the knowledge that their freedom had been replaced by a new kind of imprisonment. When they finally reached their quarters, the door slid shut behind them, sealing them inside the small, windowless room. Jane sat on the edge of one of the two bunks, her hands trembling as the full weight of their situation hit her. David paced the room, his frustration boiling over. "We've got to do something, Jane. We can't just let them keep us here. They don't see us as people anymore. They see us as specimens." "I know," Jane whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what can we do? We're on a ship, surrounded by people who think they own us. Where would we even go?" David stopped pacing and looked at her, desperation flickering in his eyes. "There's got to be a way. Maybe we can find someone on this ship who'll help us. Someone who doesn't agree with all of this." Jane shook her head. "We don't even know who we can trust. This whole world is different now. Everyone we knew, everything we remember, it's all gone. We're alone in this." For a long time, silence filled the room, both of them lost in the gravity of their situation. The reality they had clung to for so long had been ripped away, replaced by a future that was as uncertain as the past they had left behind. Finally, Jane spoke, her voice steadier than before. "We have to be smart, David. If we push too hard, they'll just lock us down tighter. We need to figure out what's really going on here, what they're planning. And then we can figure out how to get out of this. David sat down next to her, his shoulders slumping. You're right. We need more information, but it feels like we're running out of time. Jane looked into his eyes, the determination in her voice growing stronger. We've survived worse. We'll figure this out. We always do. But as the minutes ticked by, the overwhelming sense of isolation only grew. The walls of their small quarters seemed to close in, echoing the truth they could no longer ignore. They were the forgotten ones, relics of a past that no longer mattered, trapped in a future that was not their own. And once again, they were alone. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next as Jane and David adjusted to their new lives aboard the ship. They were allowed to roam certain sections, but they always felt the eyes on them. The constant surveillance, the whispered conversations of the crew who avoided getting too close. They were outcasts, anomalies in a world they barely recognized. Their interactions with the medical team became routine. Blood samples, physical exams, psychological evaluations. Every aspect of their existence was prodded and analyzed. Despite their frustrations, Jane and David played along, biding their time. They were determined to find a way out, but for now, they needed to be patient, to learn as much as they could about what was happening. One day, during another round of tests, Jane noticed something different. Dr. Harlan, the lead scientist overseeing their examinations, seemed distracted, almost uncomfortable as he went through the usual motions. His glances lingered a bit too long, his silence more telling than the usual barrage of questions. Dr. Harlan, Jane said, her voice careful but firm, you've been studying us for weeks now. What are you really looking for? The doctor hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the datapad he held. He glanced at the door, as if ensuring no one else could hear, before leaning in closer to Jane. I shouldn't be telling you this, he whispered, his voice barely audible, but you need to know. The captain, he's not just following orders. There's something more going on here. They're not just interested in how you survived. They're trying to unlock something deeper. Jane's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What are they trying to unlock? Dr. Harlan's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and pity. They believe there's something inside of you, something that evolved on Mars. They think it's not just about adaptation, but about transformation. The radiation, the isolation, the extreme conditions. They believe it did more than just keep you alive. They think it's changed you in ways we can't fully understand yet. And they're not going to stop until they find out what that is. Changed us, Jane echoed, her mind racing. How? We're still human, maybe, Dr. Harlan replied, his voice low. But they're not convinced. And if they find something different, something they can use, they won't hesitate. You won't be seen as survivors. You'll be seen as assets. And they'll do whatever it takes to control that. A cold chill ran down Jane's spine. She had suspected something was wrong, but this confirmation was worse than she had imagined. They weren't just being studied. They were being weaponized, their very existence a potential tool for whatever agenda the ship's leadership had. Why are you telling me this? Jane asked quietly, her eyes searching Dr. Harlan's face for any sign of betrayal. Because I don't agree with them, he whispered urgently. And because I don't think you're the threat they believe you are. I want to help you, but I need to be careful. If they find out I've been talking to you like this, I'll be removed from the project, or worse. Jane nodded, her mind spinning with the implications of what he was saying. What do we do now? Dr. Harlan glanced at the door again, then back at Jane. I'll try to slow down their tests, buy you some time, but you need to be ready. If they decide you're too valuable to let go, you won't be leaving this ship. Ever. The revelation from Dr. Harlan had set a new plan in motion. Jane and David spent their nights whispering in their quarters, mapping out every possibility, every chance to slip through the cracks of the ship's surveillance. They knew they couldn't simply overpower the crew. They needed to outthink them, to disappear before anyone realized what had happened. A week after Dr. Harlan's warning, the opportunity presented itself. A scheduled shift change in the ship's security team left a small window of vulnerability. It wasn't much, just a few minutes where the cameras would be switched over to a new system, where the guards would be in transition, but it was enough. With Dr. Harlan's help, they had managed to acquire access to a service hatch near the medical bay. It led to a series of maintenance tunnels that snaked through the ship, dark, cramped, and unmonitored. It wasn't an escape route, but it was a hiding place. Temporary reprieve where they could plan their next move. "Are you sure about this?" David asked as they stood outside the hatch, the hum of the ship's systems vibrating through the walls. Jane nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's now or never. If we stay here any longer, they'll find out what's happening to us. And once they do, we'll never be free again." David took a deep breath, then pulled the hatch open. They crawled inside, the metal walls closing in around them as they made their way through the narrow passage. The sound of their breathing echoed in the confined space, each movement feeling like it could betray them at any moment. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a small maintenance bay. It was empty, just as Dr. Harlan had promised. They had a few minutes before the next shift would arrive, and they needed to act fast. "There's a transport shuttle docked a few levels below us," Jane whispered, pulling up the schematics of the ship on her datapad. "It's unmanned, used for supply runs. If we can reach it, we can escape." David nodded, but there was a tension in his eyes, a fear that had been building since they first learned the truth about their situation. "And where do we go once we're off this ship? We don't even know what's out there anymore." "I don't know," Jane admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'd rather take my chances out there than stay here and let them experiment on us." They moved quickly through the maintenance bay, using every bit of cover they could find. The ship was massive, but they had memorized the layout, avoiding the heavily monitored areas and sticking to the lesser-used corridors. But just as they reached the final access point to the docking bay, they heard voices, footsteps approaching. "Quick," Jane hissed, pulling David into a nearby alcove. They pressed themselves against the wall, barely breathing as the voices grew louder. "The captain says we'll need a full report by the end of the cycle. They want to move forward with the next phase. We're running out of time. If we don't find what we're looking for soon, they'll bring in a more aggressive team. And then things will get messy." Jane's stomach twisted as the footsteps passed by, the voices fading into the distance. Messy. They didn't have much time left. They slipped out of the alcove and made their way to the shuttle. As they approached, the docking bay doors loomed before them, massive and foreboding. The shuttle was small but functional, the perfect size for a quick escape. "Here we go," David muttered, his fingers flying over the control panel to unlock the shuttle's hatch. But just as the doors slid open, a voice called out behind them. "Stop right there." Jane and David spun around to see two guards approaching, weapons drawn. Their hearts raced, the familiar sensation of panic clawing at their throats. "Get in," Jane shouted, pushing David toward the shuttle. They scrambled inside, the hatch closing just as the guards opened fire. The ship rocked slightly as the shots hit the outer hull, but it held steady. David rushed to the controls, his hands shaking as he powered up the engines. "We've got to go, now." The shuttle's systems roared to life, and within seconds, they were blasting out of the docking bay, the ship's alarms blaring behind them. They rocketed into the void of space, leaving the massive ship behind. As the shuttle sped away from the ship, Jane and David finally allowed themselves to breathe. The silence of space enveloped them, the stars stretching out in all directions. The vast, unknowable frontier that now held their future. "We did it," David whispered, staring out at the endless expanse. Jane nodded, though the reality of their situation weighed heavily on her. They had escaped, but they were far from safe. The ship would be looking for them, and they had no idea what awaited them beyond the stars. But as she gazed out at the distant planets, the glittering stars that seemed to beckon them forward, Jane felt something she hadn't in years: hope. They had survived Mars. They had escaped captivity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. For the first time in a century, their fate was truly their own. And somewhere, out in the vast unknown, they would find a place to call home.